like panel, because after this we're going right to Kaiju Confessions. Man, how did it go that fast? It always does. Hey, it's enough of the sad stuff. Everybody, welcome to a little something we like to call Korean Kaiju Chaos. We're going to be talking Korean Kaiju movies. Thank you all so much for coming. This is an interesting, kind of niche subject, so it's nice to see so many people that have shown up for it. Thank you all for coming. My name is DiManna. Amongst other things, I am the creator and author of the Godzilla Novelization project. And my goodness. You guys are too serious. In addition to that, I'm also a frequent contributor to Kaiju magazine. I'm a G-fan. I write for a living. I'm all over the place. I co-host podcasts. I do all kinds of nonsense. But the gentleman next to me has a couple of things he wants to say, including his name. Yeah. If he can remember it after such a long day running around.
It's been crazy, so I'm out of breath. My name is Elijah Thomas. I'm the host of the podcast Kaiju-Fanboy. I'm the production manager and writer for Kaiju Ramen Magazine and Kaiju Ramen Media, along with the video editor for all of their videos. So,
madman.
Yeah, I'm crazy.
This is true. But one thing that we have in common is a shared, somewhat unhealthy passion for Korean monster cinema. Yes, there we go. Love to see it. We're all looking at Japanese monsters, but the Korean chunk of the genre is so fascinating, and it is so steeped in history. And I really wanted an opportunity to get together and chat about all this stuff. Shameless self-promotion. There it is. Kaiju Ramen Magazine. There it is. So I wanted to get together. I wanted to do this, and Elijah had to be a part of it because there's no one on this planet who I would rather have done this with, because this is the only person I know who might be as nuts about this stuff as I am, and frankly, probably even more so. And we're gonna prove that here today, because you're about to get a peek into the mind of one Mr. Elijah Thomas and the obsessions of Mr. Elijah Thomas.
So that's a rabbit hole.
No, yes, basically. We're big research people. We love history, we love this kind of stuff. So Korean Kaiju cinema is a rabbit hole. And what we're gonna do here today is we're gonna talk about a handful of movies, a lot of movies that you might know some of them, you might not know a few. We're gonna talk about well-known stuff, obscure stuff, but we're gonna do it in an interesting way. We're going to frame it within a historical context and within the context of what we would argue is its own kind of unique genre. And we'll get into that more. And I'm going to let Elijah take over on that because this is really his thesis. But before we get into that, Mr. Thomas, it's time for a history lesson, isn't it?
So one of the most interesting things about the Korean Kaiju genre, as we know it right now, is the fact that it's Korean Kaiju. So kaiju are Japanese strange beasts. It's a Japanese term. It's used primarily for Japanese monsters, right? But the interesting thing is South Korea and Japan have a very, very rocky relationship. I mean, we can trace it back all the way to the 16th century, whenever Japanese troops invaded Korea, specifically the city of Busan, and basically destroyed the country. And at that point, there wasn't North Korea, South Korea, it was just one Korea. So Japanese soldiers destroyed the city and crippled the nation. And they couldn't save themselves until China helped them push Japan out. And then over the next couple hundred years, Japan and Korea would have a very interesting on and off relationship. They would work with each other, then they wouldn't. There would be back and forth, there would be fights, there would be a ton of problems throughout the history of Japan and Korea. And eventually it got to the point where they had to come to a diplomatic solution because they were getting pushed by Western countries such as British, France, and the newly formed America, United States of America, to do something. So around this time, Korea and Japan decided to create a diplomatic treaty and try to start working with each other. This eventually led to China taking control over Japan at some point, and then, eventually China and Japan, between those two problems, Korea would take another great impact. It's actually very disappointing to see the history of Korea I've read some books on it, and there's a lot of problems with the development of their country. There's a lot of fighting, a lot of attempts to reform Korea. Prior to World War II, Japan would invaded Korea, and they did something pretty bad for their culture. They essentially destroyed all of the Korean monuments that were important to their history. They forced people to change their names from Korean to Japanese. They were not allowed to identify as Korean. They had to identify as Japanese. They were banning books, literature, culture, all of that. Japan was reforming Korea to essentially the new Japan, which destroyed all of their culture for a long, long time.
Yeah, it was not a good time.
So following that, it was difficult for Koreans to survive and live, especially with their newly reformed laws and requirements. And it was pretty much that way until around World War II, whenever Japan, of course, couldn't focus on Korea and started looking on a global scale. We all know what happened in World War II and the tragic events on every side around the world. You know, people lost their lives, there was problems, there was war, it was pretty bad. But out of this, Korea got away from Japan, and Korea got to be their own nation. Even though eventually between Russia and America, the country would be divided into what we know now as North Korea and South Korea, and cause even more problems, the Korean War. So Korea's kind of had a really rough time developing. And to think that Korea has a genre based around Japanese culture is kind of interesting to think about. In Korea, Japanese stuff was actually banned until around 1998. Most things were banned. In 1998, they actually lifted the ban to allow certain things to be brought into the country. Films, but they had to meet certain requirements. If they were like Academy Award winning or something like that, they had to have a reason to be in the country. Japanese television shows could not be shown in Korea unless a Korean company picked them up and released them that way. There's actually a ton of Super Sentai that we know as Power Rangers that was brought to Korea and then dubbed into Korean and labeled as Power Rangers after Power Rangers became popular in the mid-90s.
Yeah, it's incredibly fascinating. And this is just kind of a peek at the surface of what was going on there. And you know, this is something that it's kind of interesting because we do classify. I mean, we got a nice picture of Yongary here, and to most of us that we would say, you know, that's a kaiju, and I think that's completely valid. But there's something interesting about this genre, and there's something interesting about how it splintered off from the Japanese chunk of the genre, the main part, and gradually became its own thing, but not before doing a whole lot of copying, essentially. And I guess that kind of leads us into our first bit here.
So in Korea, it was well known for Korean filmmakers to import, through special means, Japanese content and take from it to create their own. So the director of Bulgasari, let me see here, I have his name. I don't want to mispronounce it, so I want to make sure I get it perfectly correct.
The pressure is on.
The pressure is on.
No, this is different. This is a different film. So while he's looking for that, just for a little bit of context, chances are most of you are familiar with the film in the middle poster on the big screen, which is the infamous North Korean Bulgasari that Shin Sung-mok directed, where he was literally kidnapped and forced to make films for North Korea. But there is a Bulgasari that was made before Bulgasari called Bulgasari, and that's the film on the poster on the left-hand side.
And so, director Kim Yong-jae, he wanted to create essentially the Korean version of Godzilla 54. He took influence from Godzilla 54, and he made something based off of the legend of the Bulgasari, which is a Korean myth legend of a creature that consumes metal, that gradually grows and fights off lords that were being oppressive to the villagers and the people that lived within the town.
Yeah.
which would be what we see in both Bokusari and the American remake, The Adventures of Galgameth from 1996.
So there are 3 different versions of this wacky film. Pulgasari, the one in the middle, the most infamous of the bunch, is easily accessible online, free on YouTube. You can watch it. Galgameth is also out there to watch. Unfortunately, Pulgasari from 1962 is a lost film. It is the earliest known example of something that's, kaiju adjacent. It's definitely, like you said, it's definitely tapping into the 54 energy, but unfortunately the film is no longer viewable. And
this was partially because the Korean films weren't well preserved. Up until recently, the second film that came out from Korea that was giant monster related, Space Monster Wangmagwi, was thought to be lost, but a print was found in the 2000s. The Korean Film Archive got it, remastered it to HD, and we actually just recently got it a few months back from SRS Cinema on Blu-ray, DVD, and VHS. So stuff like that's really awesome to see, but for Bokusari, unfortunately, all we have is a poster, and I believe, if I remember correctly, there's a few newspaper clippings, some stills. A lot of people actually don't think it exists, and some people report that it's a short film, but I have not found anything to suggest that it was a short film. To my understanding, it was a full-length feature film.
Yeah, and I've also heard that the reviewers were not kind to it.
No, it was criticized for its very, very Muppet-like effects. A lot of people they wanted to establish and make it clear in the reviews that it was a puppet, and it looked awful, and the movie was just utter chaos. Which is interesting. I mean, I feel like the film is probably not that good, considering it was an attempt to cash in on a genre that was popular, especially by 1962. You had the highest attended Godzilla film in history, King Kong versus Godzilla, but yeah, unfortunately the film it's been lost to time, and I doubt we ever see anything of this come to light.
So it's a kind of a fascinating and a little bit of a dour beginning to this genre. For a movie that can't be seen, and even if it could be seen, it probably wasn't that outstanding to begin with. But it is fascinating because it establishes the beginning of the Korean part of the kaiju genre as being essentially a cash-in or a knockoff. And that's going to be something that you'll kind of see continue. There's a through line there. And we definitely have to, we've already touched on it a little bit, but the next film on our list is Wangmagwi, which up until literally a couple of months ago was the single most sought after lost kaiju film out there that was known to exist. There are plenty of lost films out there. You all are probably familiar with the infamous lost King Kong films from Japan from the 30s that were very likely destroyed during the fire bombings. And the frustrating thing about Wangmagwi is that it is, not only did it still exist, but people were watching it in South Korea. It wasn't a case of a film that couldn't be seen entirely, but it was landlocked into the country for years, and you could only see it at special screenings, essentially.
In 2007, actually, there was a showing in Seoul, Korea, and it was a giant monster film festival that featured basically all the films we're about to cover, and it brought up Bokusari and whatnot, which it was a great source to figure out what films they considered to be giant monsters and whatnot. But Space Monster Wangmagwi was on that list, and like Danny said, it was landlocked. And
you couldn't see it outside of Korea.
And that was because the Korean Film Archive, who held the rights to the film, were not interested in distributing it outside of their homeland. Which, I mean, even to that point, they weren't even interested in distributing within their own country because like Danny said, it was stuck at film festivals. Nobody could watch it unless you went to these Korean film festivals.
And people tried for years to try to get this thing shown, or released in some capacity, and only just recently has it happened. You can, as of right now, you can buy this film on Blu-ray. And it's going to be getting a DVD eventually here soon. It's on tape as well, if you're a weirdo like us and who collects VHS tapes, because we love them so much. But yes, it's back. Wangmagwi has been found. And what we're looking at here is an original poster and the new poster. The new poster done for the Blu-ray.
Art by
Matt Frank. And yes. Whenever I say his name, people clap every time. It's really There's not that going. But yeah, this is a film we could do a whole panel on its own.
Right.
But we can't stick around on it too long. But yeah, fascinating story behind this film, and it is a wacky film. Definitely still within the cash-in kind of genre, because we're dealing with a movie where a big kind of, it doesn't really look like it, but it reads more as ape-like in the film, carries a girl around for most of the movie. So this is Kong-esque.
And even in the film, so when I watched the film, I was not expecting to watch what I did.
It's a wacky movie.
The film is very much a comedy. It's more of a satire of the genre than a really serious entry in the Korean film monster genre. There's a couple lines in it that actually make jokes and references to King Kong.
Yes, they name drop Kong.
Multiple times, which when I heard that, I was like, maybe the subtitles messed up there. Like, why are we talking about King Kong? Especially at a point where Korea, or just giant monster movies in general, weren't to a point of satirizing themselves, or at least I thought. So this is one of those early examples of a satire of a genre that was still very early. And it's really interesting, it came from Korea. This film, it came out in 1967, actually came out, I believe, 2 months prior to Yongary, Monster from the Deep, which is the most infamous Korean monster movie of them all, I would say.
You mean this one?
Yeah, that one. So Yongary is the most popular Korean monster when it comes to your giant monster, kaiju-esque creatures. The film was co-produced by Toei, but only a little bit. The film is very much a Korean-style film. They keep the Korean and Japanese like co-production thing a little quiet. They don't like really establishing that it was a co-production, and even to that point, this was again another attempt to do a Godzilla movie with influences from Daiei's Gamera series at the time. And this film came out in the Kaiju Ega boom, 1967, the only time every major studio in Japan produced a kaiju film. Shochiku did The X from Outer Space, Nikatsu did Gappa the Trichophian Monster, Daiei did Gamera vs. Gaios.
Yes.
Toho did King Kong Escapes, which Linda Miller's here, so that's exciting.
Yes. Godzilla, and on TV we had, oh my gosh, Ultraman ended and Ultra 7 began, Mighty Jack started, that was the year Giant Robo, aka Johnny Sacco, started, Space Giants finished up its run that year. It's a busy year for the genre.
Busy year, and for Toei, their entry into the Daikaiju Ega was a co-production with Far East Entertainment, which got us Yongary, Monster from the Deep. Now the interesting thing is this film you can watch it. You can either get the public domain, in air quotes, release of the film from AIP TV, or you can get a very edited down Korean version that's only 45 minutes. Now you might be wondering, why is it 45 minutes? That's not feature length. So the reason is the original Korean version was shipped out to AIP whenever they got the rights to the film to bring it to the United States. And what happened was the Korean filmmakers, they didn't understand how filmmaking worked entirely. Film was very much a new area for the entertainment in the Korean industry. And so they shipped out the original negatives for the film.
Oops.
Which, in case nobody knows, the original negatives are like the best quality print. The original like film. There's no edits, nothing. It is the film that most people watch. And then you get your duplicates, your smaller prints, which have lesser detail and whatnot, your edited versions. So when it got to America, AIP TV edited the film, probably with the original negatives, which hurts.
Yes. Yes, it does.
And so the film became what we know today as Yongary. The film is a little different from the Korean version, from what I've been able to gather, at least that in the script for the Korean version, Yongary was supposed to be sent off into space. You can actually see on this poster in the top left-hand side a rocket, and it's lifting up into space. And a lot of people have been confused why there's that, and in the film, I can't remember where the marketing was or if it was in the film, but they said that Yongary didn't die. But in the film, he clearly...
It's pretty brutal. If anybody out there, I mean, I don't want to get too graphic on this panel, but his death scene, quote unquote, I guess, death scene, is one of the more like just painfully sad to watch out of all of them because there's
undignified.
It is an undignified ending. There's a lot of blood coming out of places blood shouldn't be coming. That's all I'm gonna say. If you know, you know.
So clearly Yongary dies in the film.
Yeah, but he don't get up from that.
But in the film, it is in the film, the kid says Yongary didn't die, but clearly he does. So what happened was, apparently, from what I've been able to read, the film ended with Yongary getting gamerified and sent off into space.
They plan Z him.
They planned Z him, but they didn't want that. They wanted the film to end with the monster dying. And so when the film came to the United States, they edited it down and ended it with that sequence. There's also some character development and whatnot that's cut, but for the most part, the film is mostly to what the original is. Now, as for the Korean version, there is a 45-minute version that the Korean Film Archive shows. It's not in a good state of
presentation, none of the above. It doesn't look great.
It's a 16mm print, edited down from what the music was, if I remember correctly. It was like the musical tracks condensed together.
Basically, whatever music was there.
And so it's a very disconjointed film, and you don't see a whole lot of new footage. There's a few seconds here and there, but for the most part, it is everything you see in the way better preserved AI TV version. So unfortunately, this is a film that, even though we have it, we don't have the original. And Yongary is very much a cash-in on the Japanese genre. So up until even this point, they had taken influence from Godzilla 54, the Gamera franchise, the Godzilla films of the 60s, and even like King Kong. And the funny thing is, while these films are taking inspiration from your Japanese films and your American films, the filmmakers of Yongary sued the people who made Space Monster Wangmagwi. And that was because they said that Yongary was stepping on the toes, or Wangmagwi, I can't speak.
Words are hard, my friend.
Was stepping on the toes of Yongary, and they were invading on the copyright for that film. Now, watching the film, that was definitely them just trying to get it away from like being released.
These two movies are nothing alike, and for the longest time, it was one of those gray areas because we didn't have one Wangmagwi to watch to see how close they were. And now, having seen it, literally anybody in this room can go watch it. There are no similarities. There are only a couple of things, maybe one or two small things. Both films have a couple that's romantically involved. One of them before their wedding, and then one on their wedding night, and then the husband has to leave to go fly he has to fly a plane in one movie and a spaceship in the other, and that's similar. That's similar. But other than that, monsters don't do the same things. There's no difference.
And even to that point, the films are very much a different tone. They're a different genre, I would argue, because Wangmagwi is very clearly a satire of the genre, whereas Yongary is attempting to be a semi-serious film. I mean, it's got some comedic sequences, but
The other thing that's similar is that they both have a precocious child doing precocious child things. But again, other than that, I think I said there were no differences before. That was a verbal typo. I meant there were these films are different.
But even after this film, we wouldn't see Korea doing anything really phenomenal, which leads us to our next slide here, which is War of the Great Monsters. Now, for Korean Kaiju fans, or just Kaiju fans, if you've heard of War of the God Monsters, these are nothing alike.
Not the same thing.
Not the same thing. They sound the same, they look the same, title-wise, but they're not the same. So War of the Great Monsters is a early 70s animated film from Korea. Animation was still very early, like it was in its early stages at this point in Korea. So SRS Cinema actually recently released the first animated film from Korea, the story of, do you remember it?
Something ill-done. I don't remember what the first word is.
I'll find it.
But it's an animated film that features a dragon, and it's the adaptation of a Korean folklore story. So that was the first one, and I believe that was in 1968, if I remember correctly.
No, 68. I think you're right. I believe you're right.
So that was the first time animation really had been introduced to Korea when it comes to film. So War of the Great Monsters followed that a couple of years later, and it's very much just taking Ultraman designs and making animated versions and having them fight. I would almost kind of compare this to like...
Hong Gildong.
Hong Gildong. Thanks, man.
So, this film... I mean, if you just look at the poster, you can kind of see like it's kind of crazy. It features some Ultraman monsters. It's got an Ultraman-esque hero. They fight. There's some human characters. I believe there's even an SSSP-inspired organization.
There's a monster team.
There's a monster team.
This is one of those weird. This treads into the legally gray Korean ripoff of Japanese thing territory, especially in animation. That we'd be here another 3 hours if we tried. If you know, you know. This is not an isolated incident, and you will see Ultraman stuff again on this list of movies. Absolutely.
But following this, Korea would start looking back at American productions. So King Kong was getting a film, a remake, a big budget Hollywood remake that we all know for its, good sequences, bad sequences, and everything in between. It's charm. Yes. So in 1976, King Kong got a remake. Now, prior to the film, a little film called Ape came out. Not to be confused with King Kong as the poster suggests. So what happened was, so Ape's a co-production between a Chinese company, a South Korean company, an American company, and a handful of other companies. Most primarily the Korean company and the American company. What a lot of people don't understand about Ape is a lot of people take it very serious. And if you know Ape, you know there's some funny moments where the ape's like winking at the camera, but it's a little more offensive.
Yeah, there will be no demonstrations on this stage. If you've seen it, you know that the monkey does something. So it's out there. It's out there.
So what the director was wanting to do was he was wanting to make a comedy. But he was told he had to do something serious. They were trying to cash in on the excitement for King Kong. And they rushed the production so much that the film actually came out before the movie they were trying to rip off. Much like how Carnosaur came out before Jurassic Park.
Yeah, they got Carnosaur out early.
So Ape is one of those movies where I think a lot of people have assessed it to be a very serious film, where in all reality, it's a comedy. It's meant to be a joke on the Kong formula, because at this point you had already had 4 King Kong movies. One of them was meant to be a satire, King Kong vs. Godzilla being that one. And at this point you had had other films that had done the King Kong story. One of them was Journey to the Center of the Earth, or also known as Where Time Began, which was a Spanish film, if I remember.
Yes, Juan Piquer Simon, the director of everybody's favorite alien movie, Pod People. If you're a Mr. Science Theater fan, you will know Pod People.
And then you had, what was the one from the 40s that is...
Which one are we talking here? There are several things from the 40s, I'm thinking.
Mighty Joe Young?
Not Mighty Joe Young, but that's another great example. So there was multiple films.
Mighty Peking Man?
Mighty Peking Man was 77.
Are we talking other like Kong?
Yeah, there was a lot of Kong.
Oh, like Queen Kong, Mighty Gorga, yada yada.
And
King Kong was just not.
And a lot of these came out in the late 70s. 1976 to 1978 saw a lot of Kong knockoffs. And that was them trying to bank on King Kong 76. It actually, if I remember correctly, got nominated for an Academy Award.
Yes, yeah.
And did it win? I'm pretty sure it did.
I think it did.
It did for special effects. The Kong effects were amazing at the time for that film.
Hooray for Rick Baker. He earned it. Yes. Let's
So Ape is a very low budget, very... There's scenes in the film that were shot with 2 drunk people standing outside of a bar that the director just pulled. Like that's how low budget and
that pretty much sets the expectation for this. Like when you go in, there's a scene where a guy in a monkey suit throttles a dead shark. It's not.
And we should establish that both of these films we're talking about do have sequences where live animals or unlive animals are
Animals that were alive at one point but not on film. Viewer discretion is advised if that's something that bothers you. Definitely be aware of that.
But at that time, Korean cinema didn't really think that was something too horrible. There's a lot of foreign markets that, especially at that time, there wasn't a lot of concern for stuff like that.
And why the heck did they get the sharks in the movie? It's because Jaws was a year old at that point, so they threw a shark in. And the shark's actually, is the shark even on this poster?
It's not on the Korean poster you have here, but on the American poster, there's a shark. And the film, there's a funny trend with getting sued and being a Korean kaiju film because Abe got sued by the people producing the King Kong film, stating that it was infringing on the King Kong copyright, which is a whole other rabbit hole of problems.
We'll be here till Tuesday.
But long story short, the film was too similar, so they were forced to retitle it. And they were afraid of getting sued again to the point that in the American poster they did include the part not to be confused with King Kong, just to, like, if they got sued again, they would be able to say, hey, we didn't say we were King Kong, we said we are not King Kong.
It's slimy. Like there's no way around it, but there's something magical about 70s Kongsploitation movies. I don't know if that's an actual term, but I'm using it.
I've always used the term Kongsploitation.
I love it.
And what's more interesting than just Kongsploitation is Jawsploitation.
Yes.
So Jaws is the first movie in the history of U.S. cinema to pass $100 million at the box office.
Yes.
It's the very first
Jaws! Love Jaws.
So Steven Spielberg's a mastermind of filmmaking. And because it did so well, people wanted to replicate it. You have your Jaws knockoffs, such as the Italian Cruel Jaws movie and whatnot, but in South Korea, they had to make a Jaws knockoff. And with that, we actually got the first ever giant crocodilian monster attack movie. That predates the film Alligator from 1978, Crocodile Fangs, also known as Horrors of the Crocodile or The Fangs of the Crocodile, came out. And this film actually has a very interesting relation to Ultraman, because a certain somebody decided to basically steal this film from the director. I'm going to let Danny kind of establish who I'm talking about here.
Okay, so how many of you out there are familiar with all of the insane Ultraman legal shenanigans that recently wrapped up? A lot of hands. Ever so briefly, and this isn't the whole panel in and of itself, but there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Sampo Sands. Mr. Sampo Sands, who thought he could pull a fast one over on Tsuburaya and claimed that he had, outside of Japan, worldwide distribution rights to the first handful of Ultraman films. He had worked with Tsuburaya officially before on a handful of films, and then when they stopped returning his calls, he just started stealing their characters. And so this gentleman, Mr. Sampo Sands, Mr. Chayo Productions himself, decided at a certain... So the first film that they worked on with Tsuburaya was the infamous Seven Ultra Brothers versus the Monster Army. And then after that, he wanted to do another Hanuman movie with this monkey god. And so he did it with the Kamen Rider characters, which Toei did not grant him permission to use. And so he just made Kamen Rider suits and had made his movie. And at this point, he started stealing characters and he started stealing footage. He didn't care. He just wanted to throw things together. So there you go. Crocodile Fangs ended up being one of the movies that he acquired, quote unquote, and started doing some duplicitous things with. So yeah, there's an interesting connection between South Korean creature features and Japanese creature features again. With a brief stopover in Thailand. How did that happen?
Yeah, so Crocodile Fangs. So this is what I would if I was writing a book about this, I would label a subsection "The Tragedy of Crocodile Fangs," because This film actually has something that I think is really, honestly, kind of depressing for the film. So, Crocodile Fangs was a co-production between a Korean company, a Taiwanese company, and so they were working together. And the director was, in fact, Korean. To tell you the name of the director, I'm going to try and find him here, because again, I don't want to butcher his name. But in the American credits, which is the only version that's available on an international scale now, because actually as of about 3 weeks ago, it came to Blu-ray for the first time after announced in 2019 from Synapse Films.
Yes, so buy this movie now. Go do it. Go get it.
In the bonus features, they actually have an interview with the South Korean director. And in the film, or in the interview, they discuss with the director about the history of it. And I'm struggling to find his name here. I have way too many notes.
Well, we'll just call him Bill, for the sake of... So Bill, you see. Noted director Bill. He's in there somewhere.
I'm locating it as we speak.
I'm trusting you on this.
So Lee Wong-se,
There you go.
he was the director of the film, but not really actually, but he was. So Chayo did all the distribution for the outside markets. And when it got to America, especially but internationally, and even in Taiwan, they omitted his name from the credits and replaced his name with Sanpot San's name. They credited him as the director and basically threw it under the rug that it was produced by, or directed by, a Korean filmmaker. And he didn't know this. He passed away last year, and the interview that was in the Blu-ray was filmed, I believe, 2 years ago. So up until the last year of his life, he didn't know that the film that he directed was never credited for him. Which is really and honestly depressing to think that he put in so much time and effort. He actually went to Taiwan to film it all. And he didn't get the credit that he deserved. And the film also had Japanese effects artists on it that weren't credited. Sans kind of snubs a lot of people in a lot of different places.
That was his claim to fame, was snubbing people that actually did hard work. So all he did was just swipe it from them.
So, speaking of swiping, he got people from Subaraya back to do some crocodile effects. There's this giant robotic crocodile with red eyes that appear in the film. There's some pretty interesting disaster sequences in the movie as well. And being able to see it in HD was very nice, apart from like VHSs and whatnot and the old DVD that didn't look too well.
Exactly.
So this film is one of those tragic stories of the director losing to the major companies, such as like Kaneko did with Toho and what he wanted for his Kaiju and GMK.
Yeah, it's similar. It's definitely similar. Ooh, this is a fun one.
So this is where the Japanese influence gets really convoluted. So Danny, can you explain what the founding of the Ming Dynasty robbery is by establishing what the founding of the Ming Dynasty is?
Well, the founding of the Ming Dynasty is I would describe it as an epic, a big special effects epic, and it's a pretty interesting film. It's got a couple of giant creatures in it. It's got a giant dragon in it. It's a really interesting movie. It's part kind of, I don't know. I'm thinking like Three Treasures would probably be like a good comparison. If you're trying to draw it to something that's a little bit more Japanese kaiju centric, it's like that. It's got this big epic feel to it. It's got sword and sorcery. It's a very interesting little movie. I believe you can still see it on YouTube.
It's on YouTube, and it features some effect sequences by Subaraya.
Yes.
Subaraya was hired to do some special effects sequences for the giant monsters that are present in the film. And if I remember correctly, this was a Taiwanese...
This is Taiwanese.
This was a Taiwanese film.
So now we've got another country in the mix here. We said it was going to get complicated, we weren't kidding. So we've got this epic film, this Taiwanese movie. What the heck does it have to do with South Korea, Elijah?
So Taiwan later produced a film called Sea Gods and Ghosts, which if you try to find this film, you're also going to find a movie called The Dragon King and the Three Princes.
That's just one of like 8 titles this thing has.
Yes.
It's got so many titles. It's one of those. It's got 1,000 titles.
So honestly, looking at these two posters, they look very much alike. They even have the same characters
Yes,
at the bottom.
two different languages, but the characters are identical. So naturally, these two completely different films have been conflated with each other. They both use stock footage from the founding of the Ming Dynasty.
They do.
But somehow these two completely different films, these South Korean pics, use the same flippant footage from the same movie, and they created two entirely different movies out of it.
But even then, like even when you watch it, there's similarities to both films.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have wrapped both up to be just the same film.
Yeah.
When I did some research, I found out that they're not. They're very much different films, but it's really difficult to try to pick apart what's for Sea Gods and Dragon King. When you're doing research, you have to be very careful with where you're looking and what you're translating because they get confused all the time.
I mean, the first time I tried to watch one of these movies, I was under the impression that it wasn't like, I think it was Sea Gods and Ghosts, and I'm fairly certain that what I ended up watching was, I thought it was Founding of Ming Dynasty. I thought I was watching the original version, and I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't right. Something's up here. And I don't even remember which version it actually was at the end of the day. So it's confusing, and sometimes if you find, like if you get on, these things will pop up on YouTube relatively frequently. Sometimes they will label one as the other by mistake, so that just makes the research even more complicated. It's crazy town. But it's fascinating. This is the kind of cool stuff that we love. You know, the weird kind of brain pretzels to try to uncover all of this information. There's an image for you.
And remember how we were talking about that footage from founding of the Ming Dynasty? So let's just hypothetically say that was not the end. Actually, not even hypothetical. Let's just say that was not the end of the reuse of the footage. So in 1985, director Jang Kim did the film War of the God Monsters, also known as The Flying
Monsters. And that was the original title. This is another film, another South Korean film that was recently gobbled up by SRS Cinema for home video release. And so it now exists. This is another film that was thought to be lost for a hot minute as well. But it is alive and well and can now be purchased on disc. And this is a funky one.
So what happened is the director smuggled footage from, I believe it was Ultra 7,
Ultraman Ace, Ultra 7, a little bit of Ace, and
Jumbo Ace.
A little bit of Jumbo Ace.
And Return of Ultraman.
It's like 5 or 6 shows.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it took music from those as well,
Mm-hmm.
and spliced them up into a film, in air quotes, and released it as its own thing. So War of the God Monsters also features footage from founding of the Ming Dynasty, which was done by Tsuburaya. So it's a hodgepodge of like kind of the best of, really.
It is. And they crafted a new story around it involving. I'm using the word story loosely here. You have to. I'm throwing the movie a bone here. There's a professor who's looking for dinosaurs, and he hires a woman to take care of his daughter, but the woman turns out to be a reporter posing as I don't know.
It's basically a fever dream. It's a very weird movie.
It is worth a watch. It is absolutely worth a watch, even if for no other reason than it's just a highlight reel of really good Tsuburaya special effects. Other than that.
And even following Ultraman, Sentai, as I mentioned earlier, got brought over to Korea. And even before that, filmmakers were trying to take that idea and bring it over. So we have stuff like Space Police Human Power, the Thunder May franchise, and my personal favorite, Morph Warrior Trans and Toady.
You guys don't know. Like it's
so.
How do you even want to describe Morph Warrior Trans and Toady?
So I'm just going to call the film Toady just for simplicity.
Yes.
So it's a 2-part film that was produced as a straight-to-video, straight-to VHS movie that was marketing for toys. These were all kind of markets for toys, for people to purchase and whatnot. But what's even more interesting about the Toady film is it actually beat Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for the first ever multiracial Sentai team, which is something that a lot of people don't know. In Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, there is a multiracial team. You've got white people, you've got black people, you've got all the race, you've got a huge group of people. And that was actually done prior in Toady, which is kind of interesting because it's a Korean film. You You wouldn't think that they would be able to afford or find people, but they did. And we have this magical two-parter film that has giant monsters. It has a toad that is like a superhero that can save the day. You've got your Sentai team, you've got evil villains, you've got everything.
Should we mention that the toad has like poison gas farts? I feel like we should mention that. I feel like the people should know. They didn't know it's entirely love it. This thing's a trip and a half, guys. Like this is a bizarre film. Also, very clearly got some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle influence on it, because this was not, again, talking about animated rip-offs. There was some Mutant Ninja Turtle stuff going on in Korea as well. This is a rabbit hole that could take us the rest of the panel, but we have a couple more people we need to talk about.
And this is where Shin Hong-rae becomes very relevant. So Shin Hong-rae was a comedian actor that did the Thunder Bay films. He was in all of them besides, I believe, 2, due to scheduling conflicts and whatnot. But he turned into a director. And he is probably the most prolific Korean director from the 90s. His big idea was to bring Korean films to the Hollywood standards of what was at the time. So you have stuff like Yongary and Dinosaur Zuzu, Dragon Tuka, Tyrannosaurus Claw, and most famously, Yongary, or as it's known in the United States, Reptilian. So we're going to kind of talk about each film momentarily, and then we're going to end on Reptilian and kind of tell you what the disaster of that film is.
Yeah, and we do have to kind of be brisk about it because we are running short on time, but man, I mean, again, Yonggu is his own topic. We could just sit here and talk about Yonggu.
It's a whole franchise. It's a character that Shin Hong-rae plays, and he had him appear in Dinosaur Zuzu, and we actually see a dinosaur that's very closely resemblant to the original Yongary design.
A lot of people have thought it was Yongary for a long, long time. They thought, is this like a sequel? Is this a fan film? What is this? It's a real movie, but this is not Yongary, even though he has a nose horn and breathes fire and looks like Yongary. He's not. But it's clear that Shin Hong-rae really liked Yongary. He clearly did. He had a lot of affinity for the character. And it is definitely an homage. And there are creatures that pop up in multiple Shin Hong-rae movies. I mean, Tyrannosaurus Claw is pretty well known. That's basically a caveman picture. It's got some big, silly rubber dinosaurs in it. It's basically like him trying to do 1 million years BC. It's like him trying to do a hammer dinosaur picture. Dragon Tuka, oh my gosh, Dragon Tuka. Dragon Tuka is like, what even is Dragon Tuka?
I would say it's like a samurai.
It's like samurai.
Blend with sentai.
It's samurai, sentai, fantasy, something.
It's a hodgepodge of a lot of different genres, and it's I would argue it's probably the craziest out of all of them. If I remember correctly, there's time travel.
Yeah, there's like a portal. It's weird.
But what's weirder than that, for me at least, is the development of what Yongary became. So Shin Hong-rae wanted to create the biggest movie that Korea ever saw. I mean, he technically did that. Yongary is actually was the most expensive
film made in the country at that point, somehow.
And what happened was Shin Hong-rae directed the film chronologically. So from the moment you start the film, he filmed it, and just every cut, he would just cut, go do that scene, come back and continue. He would film it in a way that was very uncanny, very unusual, very immature for a director who had done so much work, which created a lot of problems for the film. They actually had to work with multiple companies, actually even working with the government at one point to get enough money to budget the film. And what happened eventually is the film ran out of money. So everybody might have heard of the alternative version, the original version of Yongary with suits. That doesn't exist. There was no suits ever used for this film besides what you see in the movie. The suits were made to be scanned in and animated via CGI. And towards the end of the film, they ran out of money because they were doing it in order of how the film proceeds, right? So as you're watching the final fight, all the monsters eventually become wire work. Just like these these computer-generated wires, and the entire film just stops. Eventually, it just slowly degrades. And that's because they couldn't afford to make the film. And what's the funniest part about it is they put it out. They just were like, okay, we're out of money, we need money, so they had a premiere in Seoul, they released it, and it did horribly. Everybody hated it for some reason.
Couldn't imagine why. Wirework disintegrating monsters. Couldn't imagine why.
So the film was shelved for a couple of years, and then Yongary came back and said, okay, with a little more money, I can make this work. This is personally, it's got a soft spot for me because I think Reptilian is an example of an enduring film. The director wanted to bring Korea to an international market. He marketed the film internationally, and eventually it just got to the point where it failed. It failed miserably. But we did get the cut known as Reptilian, with new scenes refilmed with all the original actors, animation completed? I mean, it's
done.
It's done.
Good.
It's done.
Jetpacks.
And so we get this film that's kind of this letter of endurance for this director that just wanted his country to get recognized. He wanted his country to become something like what Japan was. You know, producing stuff for the international market and people acknowledging it and praising it and just bringing culture of Korea to the international world.
It was something he was passionate about. But we're still stuck firmly in copycat territory here, if you haven't noticed. These are all films that are trying to do something. I mentioned the Hammer film here, we mentioned Sentai. Clearly, Yongary, especially in its reptilian form, has a lot of G98 in it. So we're still firmly stuck within a Korean kaiju genre that's kind of aping other things, right? Well, this is where things take a bit of an interesting turn. This is how we will wrap this up with a movie you might have seen called The Host.
So, Bong Joon-ho is probably one of the most prolific South Korean directors internationally. He directed the Academy Award-winning film Parasite, which is an amazing movie if you haven't seen it.
Yes, it's a great movie.
But before that, when he was still starting out, he developed a film called The Host. And The Host is what I would say the equivalent to the original 1954 film for Godzilla. And this is where the idea of what Korean kaiju truly means kind of comes in. So The Host did extraordinarily well, not only financially but critically. It's a well-loved film. People compared it to Jaws. People have compared it to Godzilla 54. It is a very well-made film. But what's more interesting about The Host is its original Korean title. So its original Korean title is not The Host. It's actually the term for monster in Korean. And I don't really want to pronounce it because I butcher it.
It's Gwangho, I believe. Gwangho is how you say it. I'm saying it wrong, I'm sorry. I think that's right. I think I say that's right.
So what's interesting about this is this film is not copycatting anything. This film is establishing its own genre, its own thing. It's not trying to do anything that's already been done before. What Bong Joon-ho is doing is creating his own film for Korea. This is a Korean film. And the title The Host not only is symbolic for the creatures and the humans, but also the US occupation of Korea at the time, dealing with the problems politically. I could dive into that, the whole metaphorical meaning behind The Host, but it's a criticism against influences on Korea. It's a metaphor about how Korean culture needs to be Korean culture and not interfered with by outside countries like Japan or America, which up until this point is what basically filled their giant monster genre.
And as you can see as we move along here to almost our last slide here, and now think of that. A lot of people have seen it. It's a silly movie. I love it to death. But it's not copying things like the previous films that we talked about did. It's really kind of doing its own thing. Of course, Dragon Wars 2 never happened, but whatever. So this is where we start getting into the establishment of a genre. We're not in the Japanese version anymore. We're not copying things anymore. Now we have a whole series of movies like this. We have Jaws, Sector 7, Okja, also by Bong Joon-ho, Monstrum. These are all movies that bring the host to mind. They're all post-host films, right? These are films that are now firmly established within what Elijah has dubbed the global genre. A genre that started out as basically copying Japanese kaiju films, but now it's really kind of doing its own thing.
And even, I mean, we've seen it in just general pop culture. The idea of Korean culture has become a popular thing. K-pop, K-dramas, Parasite, like all those Korean things are becoming popular within the international world. Parasite winning the Academy Award for Best Picture was a huge push for Korean cinema. And not only that, but since 2006, Bong Joon-ho has established a genre that is not like the Japanese kaiju films. It doesn't feature men in suits, it doesn't feature Godzilla or anything like that. It's not copying any other genre. It's doing its own thing. It's creating a genre that is very much a Korean genre. It's covering Korean problems, Korean folklore with stuff like Monstrum, Korean issues like Okja, The Host, Sector 7, and it's no longer copying or following what came before it, but establishing something new, something fresh, something that is no longer required to fall under the kaiju genre, but its own genre.
And that is about as cool of a way I think we could end this. Unfortunately, we do not have time for questions. We have to make way for Kaiju Confessions here. So, it's time to dance, y'all. Thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you for your